before World War One, I'm going to now walk through historically how the system developed and what kind of a turnaround. And the basic theme of this lecture is we've discussed finance capitalism in the last two lectures. State capitalist imperialism is somewhat different from private sector finance capitalism. The aims of a state are, of the United States in world military power actually end up shrinking the economy and are not only disruptive of industrial capitalism, but they're not even in the interests of private bankers. They're in the interest of government and Cold War developers. Before World War I, European nations had a long tradition of forgiving loans made to allies to finance their participation in a common war effort. But following World War I, the United States did something that was a gray area to Europeans. It insisted that all the other allies pay for the arms sales that they'd bought prior to America's participation in the war. America said, well, of course, once we're allies, we will pay our share and fight the war with you. But you bought arms with us before we went into the war. And in fact, one of the reasons that America went into the war, World War I, on the side of England and France, is it had lent England and France so much money to pay the arms to fight Germany, that if it went on the side of Germany, well, it wouldn't get repaid. It went on the side of its debtors, so to make sure that its debtors would have enough money and be willing to repay it when the war was over. So the United States asked for payment. The Allies then turned to Germany to provide the money and imposed reparations far beyond the $28 billion that the United States charged them for the arms debts that they'd sold. The $28 billion may not sound like a lot now, but those were in 1920 dollars, not 2020. A dollar went a lot further a century ago. And Germany's reparations bill was sent at more than twice this amount. It's $60 billion in 1921, all payable in the gold equivalent of US dollars. So this totaled altogether $88 billion. And these intergovernmental debts did not have any counterpart in Germany's foreseeable ability to pay. It couldn't export enough money to raise the money to pay the reparations because America raised its tariffs against German and foreign goods. And other countries were devastated by the war. And because they had to use their international reserves to pay the United States, they couldn't afford to buy German exports. So the magnitude of the debts that Europe had, the $88 billion after World War I, far exceeded the value of private international investments. And they were set without any calculation of Germany's ability to pay or of the United States and other allies' willingness to enable them to pay by buying German and other European exports. So this was not a private sector form of financial imperialism. Instead of serving the interests of Wall Street financiers, the harsh US government demands led to a breakdown of world finance. It led to the stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression, which destroyed capital, didn't build it up. And yet, the primacy of government over private interests was assumed to be something natural and even stable. It was everybody accepted a century ago that debt payments to the U.S. government should take precedence over payments owed to other concerns for private creditors or bondholders, even to the point of imposing domestic austerity and unemployment and destroying their own economies. Europe was willing to destroy its own economy in the 1920s simply to pay the United States instead of saying, look, the war's over. We're not going to impoverish ourselves and have another war just in order to pay you. You have the gold, we don't. Okay, we're going to go on to something besides gold. We're going to figure out a way to move off gold and off the dollar and just do it among themselves. They could have done that. Nobody even thought about it. From the left wing of the political spectrum, the labor parties, the socialist parties tried just as hard as the right wing parties to say a debt is a debt, we have to pay it. So the debt morass showed the tragedy of acceding to creditor demands that debts should be paid even at the cost of imposing deep economic destruction. The world was able to sacrifice its growth and stability by agreeing to satisfy the US creditor demands, even when they were so large that debtors could pay only by imposing a depression on themselves and ending up looking like Greece looks today and Argentina looks today. It seems amazing that they did. That's what they did. Prior to World War I, government intervention in foreign lands usually followed private commerce and investment. So there was, of course, imperialism and colonialism by Europe, but the governments usually backed the private companies, and whatever the private businessmen who were pretty prominent in the government wanted, the government would back. But government didn't have a separate interest apart from the private sector. What the private investors wanted in Europe's colonies, they wanted minerals, they wanted tropical plants and other raw materials, and they wanted these countries as captive markets. The Britain Sterling area, the Frank zone, every imperial country tried to get colonies and protectorates that would act as its own market. So governments used military and naval force to seize territories, to expand the economic interest of their nationals, and to exclude the capitalists of other countries, but it was still private capital backed by military force. But the intergovernmental super imperialism that emerged in America's hands after World War I was financial in character, not military. America didn't have to conquer colonies. It simply conquered the hearts and minds of Europe and other countries. It conquered the minds so that they believed that they had to pay foreign debts, even sacrificing their own national hopes for growth. So the emergence of the United States government as the overwhelming world creditor was not a product of private investment. It wasn't a case of bondholders lending money to foreign governments and then having the U.S. government send in the Marines to collect. It was the U.S. government that was the creditor, not private banks, not private bondholders. And it was the government that creditors position that determined the foreign policy of the United States, not private capital investment. Nobody had anticipated that before World War I. The only common denominator with Europe was the overriding Western civilization principle that all debts have to be paid regardless of how socially destabilizing the consequences are. And that belief is the center point of almost all the lectures that I'm going to be giving. And it's the centerpiece that enabled the United States to consolidate its position by having other countries follow America's financial self-interest, even at the cost of their own interests. So for the first time in modern history, international finance became dominated by a single government, not a group of governments. And this single government, the U.S. financial claims, far overshadowed any kind of private investment. There was very little U.S. private investment in Europe at the time World War I ended. So no writer had anticipated that the main destabilizing and exploitative factor was going to be government, not private capital. In 1917, during the war, Lenin wrote Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And he anticipated that private capital and its growing concentration would become the major cause of further future conflict. And to many other observers, the hope for peace seemed to lie in the resumption of international credit and investment in private hands, and everybody looked for intergovernmental cooperation to make sure that private investment didn't cause war. Well, in fact, what you had was just the opposite. You had the private investors, private banks, private bondholders telling the United States, don't insist on paying the debts. The bankers, again and again in the 1920s, under the Republican administrations, asked the government to reduce the claims on the Allies so that Europe could grow and there could be a financial market and a business market for American investment and exporters out to Europe. The U.S. government said no. It's the overriding concern of American diplomacy with purely world power, even at the cost of destroying not only other countries, but reducing the ability of its own U.S. banking and financial sector to make money. It disrupted the prosperity of the world. So within the emerging post-war finance capitalism, private and government financial policies were at cross purposes. That's why President Hoover, 1931, announced a moratorium on U.S. international debt demands and German reparations. Stock markets jumped throughout the whole world. Finally, they said, with getting government debt collection and austerity plans out of the way, can now revive business, it'll revive export trade, improvements in foreign exchange conditions, more than repaid the United States for its loss of the $250 million by sum of foreign debt service that it was getting, that it forgave in 1931. So debt relief, suspending intergovernmental claims, had a good positive effect on the private international finance capital, not the reverse. And in fact, the conflict quickly broke out at the London Economic Conference in 1933 as incoming President Franklin Roosevelt replaced the Republican Herbert Hoover. Hoover, along with Republican Treasury Secretary Ogden Mills, supported the Eastern banking interests. Roosevelt's advisor, Raymond Moley, and his team mistrusted Wall Street bankers, the bankers viewed U.S. government demands as a creditor as antithetical to their own ambitions. They wanted the government creditor claims out of the picture. So led by the J.P. Morgan partner, Russell Leffingwell, the Wall Street internationalists tried to persuade a State Department Democrat under Roosevelt, Norman Davis, to a position of influence. They wanted their own agents of influence in the Democratic Party. And Moley, Roosevelt's advisor, expressed his mistrust, and he wrote that Davis, quote, wanted to get the debts out of the way to facilitate reviving private lending to Europe, unquote. That's why President Roosevelt rejected Davis's pro-Wall Street advice, and Roosevelt's ideas were antithetical to those of the large banking sector. So the U.S. Aim was to subordinate foreign interests to those of its government creditor claims, while escalating America's protective tariffs and quotas. America raised its tariffs, making it even harder for Europe to earn the money to balance its payments and trade with the United States. And this was not really an international world leadership seeking overall world economic recovery. Later, pro-American historians say, well, America's world leadership failed. America didn't want world leadership. It was nationalist. America rejected internationalist leadership because it was out for the United States to dominate other countries. And that was the America First policy that was the American Firsters accused the Roosevelt administration of rejecting world leadership. And Roosevelt said, well, what does it mean, America First? Is it the American government first? Or is it the Wall Street creditors and the financial class first? Roosevelt and his advisors did not want the kind of international leadership that would have rehabilitated British, French, and other European governments and their economies as equals. In their mind, freeing Europe from having to pay its war debts to the United States would leave their governments with more money to rearm and threaten another world war. And in fact, Roosevelt's advisor said, well, if you forgive them their debts, they're just going to use their money to buy more arms and go to war.